Okay, so now we're going to talk about voting and elections. This is one of those important things, that I hope that each one of you is doing, which is being registered to vote and regularly, exercising that right to vote. So, who controls our elections? At the state, we have state and local control of elections. Here in Riverside County, the Riverside County Registrar of Voters is the body that regulates elections countywide. Now, we also have the state Secretary of State's office in Sacramento that runs the election statewide. So there are two different bodies. So the individual states conduct all general elections in the United States, including those for presidents and other federal offices. And that's why, you have different states that have different types of elections, which we will go into that further in this lesson. So state offices supervise and coordinate the efforts of each county, and municipality election offices that oversee the individual precincts. So, when you get that thing in the mail saying, hey, let's vote, you go to your individual precincts. They break the community into precincts because it would be impossible for, everybody to go to, the Temecula Mount Sac, Mount San Jacinto campus and vote on election day because that would just be too many people. You would need people to break it down. So we also have early voting, absentee voting, and other functions that are done at the county level. They're the ones who tabulate it and then they report it to the Secretary of State and they certify it. The results are tabulated and certified at each level. Okay, so one of the important things we talk about is the Voting Rights Act. I've actually provided a link to a video in your overviews this week showing, things about like the Louisiana voting literacy test, which is something that during the civil rights era was used to prevent minorities from voting. It's pretty insane. So here is an example, of a DMV. So do you guys know when you go to the DMV, you can actually register to vote. So it's kind of, nice. You can do everything there. If you need to change your address, this is an idea of the form. So state and citizen interest in the electoral process. So election law seeks to protect the integrity of elections by ensuring fair processes, implementing secure voting technologies that are accessible to as many voters as possible, maintaining the privacy and accuracy of critical voter and election data, enforcing common standards for the language of the ballot text, preventing fraud, and increasing voter participation. What does all that mean, right? So political ideologies and parties often disagree on where to prioritize these interests or how to best achieve these interests. So it's going to be no surprise if I tell you that in 2020, there was election irregularity issues, raised throughout the country. One example I could give is in Maricopa County, which is in Arizona. Every election, it seems like Maricopa County has issues. In one, they were giving Sharpies to people to fill out the ballot. Well, you're supposed to use a ballpoint pen to fill out the ballot. And that caused these ballots to be, to be spoiled to the point where they cannot be used. That means these votes don't count. We have issues of privacy. We have how do you serve that many people on that day? So many different issues, right? We've had, nationwide, we probably all know the name Dominion. Dominion voting, is a voting machine that, they argue is susceptible to hacking. I've never used it. I don't know. There's so many different issues to consider. And, the Democrats and the Republicans are going to defer when they come to these issues. It's important to note these election issues are kind of what's behind at least the Fulton County indictment of President Trump, the allegations of a stolen election. It'll be interesting to see what happens. So how do we measure voter turnout? One thing that you're going to be asked to do is to write an essay, giving ideas on how we can increase voter turnout. So we look at, how many people can vote? How many are eligible to vote? You have to be 18 to vote, correct? Well, in certain criminal offenses, you lose your civil right to vote. So you wouldn't be voting eligible. Then how many are registered? So we dwindle all that down. And how many, look at the number. You have 206 million that are registered to vote, and only about 159 million voted. So how do we increase that number? So again, going to disenfranchisement. So following the ratification of the Civil Rights Amendment after the Civil War, many states, especially in the South, introduced a variety of voter registration requirements to prevent African Americans from voting. This included poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. So poll taxes, you have to pay a fee to vote. The literacy test, please see that video, but it was a test. They had 10 minutes to take it. If they got any one of them wrong, they could not vote. And it had nothing to do with voting. Then we had grandfather clauses, which require, looked at the historical, population and requirements to vote, and basically was just a way to prevent African Americans from voting. So in 1965, we had the Voting Rights Act passed to combat these issues. The Supreme Court has also made decisions striking down discriminatory voter laws and grandfather clauses. It's important to note that every few years, Congress has to reenact this Voting Rights Act, because part of that had the Department of Justice actually monitoring the issues in the South for disenfranchisement so they could step in and take action. They are still monitoring those issues today. All right, so let's talk about voter registration. Voter registration is important. So constitutionally, we cannot exclude voters based on race, sex, or age, as long as a person is 18 years old. If we try and discriminate based on those, we can't. So then each state determines its own voter registration requirements, but they must be constitutional and comply with the federal laws of the matter. So you can't say, hey, in Kansas, I want 16-year-olds to vote. It doesn't work that way. The Help America Vote Act of 2002 requires states to maintain accurate voter registration rolls and election records to notify voters if they'll be purged from voter rolls. That's an interesting thing. I would ask you guys to consider, if someone's not voting on a regular basis, should they lose that right? Is that about one of those things that makes us an American, our civic duty, which is to vote? I'd really like to explore that issue with you guys. So there can be additional state voter registration requirements. So they can exclude incarcerated individuals or those with felony criminal convictions. Those who cannot prove their residency in the state with a valid state-issued form of ID. Individuals without government ID, individuals who cannot prove their age or citizenship, and residents who cannot prove they live in the state or municipality. And that, at least the location issue goes back to, how do we ensure that people only vote once and we have multiple precincts across the county, across the city? And, think about Inez Road in Temecula. It's a long street. It is not unfeasible that during an election cycle, there might be 4 or 5 different places to vote. Well, if we don't have to prove our residency via a government issued ID, what's stopping me from going place to place to place to place and voting multiple times? That is an issue. Okay, but there are also other issues related to voter ID laws. So how do you register to vote? Voter is different state to state. So federal laws force states to offer, these registration opportunities when they provide services such as you get your driver's license or your ID card. Well, guess what? When you get your driver's license, you're usually 16. So at that point, you couldn't register to vote, but a lot of high schools have it. The school here has the ability to register to vote. You can do it online with the county registrar. So we have plenty of ways for you to vote. So you have to complete a form, some offer online. And then it's really interesting is Oregon automatically enrolls voting eligible citizens. So that's kind of interesting. But then we look at, like we looked at earlier, voter turnout versus how many people can vote. Voter turnout is calculated by comparing how many ballots were cast in a particular election to the number of people who could have voted in that election. And what influences this turnout? So a lot of people will say they vote in the important elections. Those are the presidential elections. But I would argue to you that every election is important. So individuals between the ages of 18 and 25 are least likely to vote. College students, they don't really seem to get why it's so important, which is why I hope you take that from this class. Now, people who are older, people 75 65 to 74 are more likely to vote. So, youth, frequent moving, their level of education, lower tax and regulatory burdens, less dependence on social programs, lack of engagement with government activities, apathy, and your family. Those all cause low voter turnout. Sometimes, if you're not used to paying a higher tax rate and understanding what's going on economically, you may not really care. But when Uncle Sam's taking that money out of your bank account, your paycheck that you worked hard for, you're more likely to vote. So likely voters. Who are our likely voters? This is important. In addition to being older, people with higher levels of income, wealth, and education vote more. Race also affects these patterns. Caucasians are more likely to vote than minorities. So political parties and campaigns, they try and figure out who these likely voters are within their different, precincts. We got to see who votes regularly. Did you know that when you call Congress, if you try and get something done by your congressman, they will actually look and see if you vote regularly. And that will end up being, if you vote regularly, you'll get more priority than someone else. So lower voter turnout groups may feel that a certain candidate their parties don't understand or care about their needs. But also, campaigns have limited amounts of time and money. They do try and target where they get the biggest bang for their buck. So here's more reasons. We do study low voter turnout, and your paper, we're going to be looking at how do we get people to vote? I want to know, how do we increase this? Some people say they're too busy. Childcare, family care, or work conflicts. Did you know your employer has to let you off to work? Lack of transportation. You don't know where to vote. Frustrated or cannot use the voting technology. Those are those Dominion systems. Restrictive voter laws such as ID requirements. They don't really have any interest in the candidates or the issues. They can't decide on the issues, or they're just tired of it. So to respond to some of these, we have absentee ballots that you can register for, and absentee ballots, they come to you a few weeks before the election. So you do have time to get those, to really look at the ballots, make your decisions, and get them turned in. It does cost a stamp. You can also take it to any county building and turn it in for free. At least that's in Riverside County. That would help alleviate the lack of transportation, don't know where to vote, too busy, do it on your own time. Restricted voter laws, that becomes an interesting issue that coming in California, right, we always have a Californian hat on. But someone had explained to me, back in states where it may be harder to get to a voting place. Think about even the elderly who may not drive anymore and are not going to go through to the DMV to get their ID. It takes too much time, too much energy, hard for them. Should they be precluded from voting? Should a low-income family who can't, pay, I think it's like $35 for a real ID, who can't get a real ID, approved to get a real ID, should they be precluded from voting? Those are all fundamental rights. But again, we have to balance those rights with, how do we know that you're not voting multiple times? How do we know that you're voting in the proper election? These are all different things that they have to take into consideration. So what is the election cycle? We're in the middle of an election cycle right now for president. 2024, November 2024, we vote for president again. So right now we are in the, it's usually called the invisible primary. This is before we actually get to the nominating parties. So next summer, we're going to see the DNC and the RNC, the national committees, having a convention. And at that convention, they will narrow the field to those running for office and see who they're going to nominate to represent the party for the presidency. Typically, the Democratic, the incumbent who has one more term to run, they're given the nomination. There's been some analysts saying lately that may not happen this time, which would actually be very historical. And then, right now we're going through the process where we see the Republicans having their debates, and that'll be used to whittle down the candidates. Then we have the primary, the primary campaign, and that's what they're doing right now. They have town halls, meetings, rallies. They run campaign ads. They want you to vote for them. Right now, at least at the last debate, I think there was 8 people on stage, not including Donald Trump. So right now there's 9 major, people vying for the nomination, and I anticipate to see that narrowing. So then we have primaries and caucuses. That's where we select who we want for that. So in California, we have a closed primary. So if you're registered Republican, you'll get a Republican ballot. If you're registered Democrat, you'll get a Democrat ballot, and you'll pick from those people. So then the caucuses are interesting. They happen in places like in Iowa, and that is where, there's basically town meetings. The candidates give their speeches, people from the party give their speeches, and you have to stand by whoever you vote for. Really interesting system. We couldn't do it in California. So we have our conventions, and then after the conventions, we start the general election campaign. So we're going to vote in November of 2024 for the presidency. But we do have some states that do, early voting. We don't, gone are the days of election day, or like the election week to 2 weeks, 3 weeks, which can be a problem. But then it's important to note the Electoral College, those are who vote for the president. We'll talk more about the Electoral College later. So let's see, these primaries, right? They look and feel like general elections to voters, but only one party is on the ballot. So we have a closed primary. In other states, you have an open primary where you can choose which ballot you want. And then these caucuses are these informal meetings. I'm really disappointed that there's no videotape footage out there of a caucus, because it is unique, and I'd be interested as a student of political science to really see it. Okay, and then we go to the conventions. So then delegates represent the primary voters at the conventions. When John McCain ran, there were some friends of mine who she went to college with McCain's daughter. So she actually got to go, and she got to cast a vote at the convention, which I thought was interesting. They got to meet different people. Exciting for us political science nerds. So what is this Electoral College? These are the people that actually vote for the president. So when voting for a particular presidential candidate on their ballot, voters are selecting electors to represent their vote. So the Electoral College actually convenes in December. This is where you hear the discussion of the road to 270. We got to get 270 to win a majority and for to become president. Now that means if we have the popular vote, we may not win. Ideally, the Electoral College is supposed to represent what the people want in that state. Let's see how it goes. So the number of electors are apportioned to each state matches the size of its congressional delegation. So 1 elector for each representative from the state and senator. Okay, so there's 538 electors in there, and 270 is our majority. Sometimes, like I said, the Electoral College and the popular vote split, meaning, the winner of the popular vote fails to win a majority of the electors. This happened in 2000 and 2016. So splits typically occur, because votes for the popular vote winner were not distributed favorably among states with large numbers of electors. So then the faithless elector problem occurs when an elector disregards voter preferences. Faithless electors are exceedingly rare, nowadays. Several states that they require electors to follow the state's popular vote in a winner-take-all system. So there is only a couple states that actually split where the electors go. Others, they apportion it based on the popular vote. Typically, like California, will always go blue, simply because it's a heavily, Democratic area. So there is arguments that we should abolish the Electoral College, because it's not really representing the will of the people as an argument. But we would have to amend the Constitution to do that. Small states and Republicans would be unlikely to support it, because it would negatively affect their campaign strategies and shift power towards, states like California. We might be the one that decides. So it'd be a problem. Oh, campaign finance. This is fun. I'm learning about this with my hopes to eventually run for office. So the Federal Election Commission controls and keeps records of federal campaign donations. There's regulations that limit the amount individuals and organizations may donate to campaigns, and candidates have to disclose the source of their funds. You can actually go on the county registrar's website and you can see who's donating to local campaigns. And there's federal websites to do it at the federal level. So there is an important Supreme Court decision known as Citizens United that holds that political donations are a form of protected political speech because you're putting your money where your support is. The court has struck down reforms limiting political advertisements and permitted the creation of political action committees, which are organizations that can raise unlimited funds as long as they do not coordinate with the candidates' campaigns. So that'll be more of like a policy-based issue or just something not unique to the individual. So they have the State of America Political Action Committee. They have, the Gun Rights Political Action Committee, things like that. All right, so we talked about different types of democracy. So we have the idea of direct democracy, and that is what we do here in California. And that allows policy initiatives to be decided by popular vote. So we have, propositions. We've all read those ballots that are a pain in the butt to read because we have to figure out what the propositions mean. We have referendums where we can say yes or no on a law. So proposition and referendum are similar. And then recall is the removal of a politician. So a few years ago, we tried to remove and recall Governor Newsom. Riverside County was the only county across the country, across the state, sorry, not the country, to say, yes, we want to recall him. Good job, Riverside County. Okay, that is our exploration of campaigns. Please reach out if you have any questions.